read the whole thing. This is going to take a lot of time, so I'll just kind of summarize it. But Psalm 139 starts out, God, you know me when I'm sitting, when I'm walking, everywhere I go. You're with me. I can't flee away from you. There's nowhere farthest to the east or the west, or nowhere up high in heaven or down below that I can go and you're not there. You are there with me all the time. You've been there with me even before I was born, before I even knew who I was. You were there. So it talks about God being, you can't flee from God. Maybe that's concerning, but that's also comforting. I think of it as sort of Elijah's psalm, because Elijah tried to run away, and he kept running from God, and God kept providing for him. He got to the mountain, and finally God was like, what are you doing here? You need to go back and do your stuff. Or Jonah, right? Jonah tries to run away from God. So that psalm is saying you can't. But then a part that most people don't. So after how precious are your thoughts? Then it goes like this. Oh God, that you would slay the wicked, that men of blood would depart from me. With deceit they rebel against you and set your designs not. Do I not hate those who hate you, abhor those who rise against you? I hate them with a perfect hate, and they are foes to me. Oh, whatever. But then the next verse. Oh, search me, God, know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See that my path is not wicked, and lead me in the way of eternity. The way I read that is, God is with you no matter how far you go, no matter where you were way back, and even when you're being a jerk, even when you're angry, just angry, God's still there. And so it's kind of jarring to hear it, but I think it makes it even more profound that it's not just a physical or time thing, but even when we're at our worst, God's still there. Okay, so what? Before I forget these things. So I brought some Bibles that are not your normal, typical Bibles that most people use, just because sometimes it's good to have ones that are a little not what you always hear. So typically in churches, Lutherans, we hear from the NRSV, which is sort of a descendant of the King James at some point, but the same family, very biblical sounding, but also reading level, it's like 8th, 9th grade, which that may be fine for some people, but it isn't for a lot of people, believe it or not. So there's this one, I think I saw one over there, the Common English, Contemporary English version, which I was reading from earlier, is a good one with the vocabulary is smaller. It seems to be a good translation, but it's also a lot easier to read and to understand. This is the one that we give out to younger kids at church, because I don't know what the exact grade level is, but like 3rd grade or 4th grade or something. So a nice, good one. If it's just really sounding like what's going on, this might simplify it a little bit. Another Bible that is kind of out of our regular tradition is the Common English Bible. It's a little confusing. We have CEV and CEB. This kind of came out of, I think, mostly the Methodist tradition. It's a couple of decades old now. But it doesn't even take the old biblical sayings or phrases at all. It just starts anew and uses different words. Instead of repent, it always says change your hearts and lives. It's got lots of things that it says that are not what you're expecting. So sometimes it's nice, especially if it's a passage that you're familiar with, to read one that's coming at it a totally different way. It's faithful translation. It's good. It just hits the ear a little differently. The first one that I found that did that I really enjoyed was called the New Jerusalem Bible, because again that kind of came from a different tradition, and so it says things a little differently. And now they have an updated version. It's called the Revised New Jerusalem Bible. I just got this 2 weeks ago, and I'm a Bible nerd, so I was really excited when I got it. It's good, and the poetry is really good. It's great. It used to have more notes, but it's another really good translation that's like in a different family. And then finally, for the Old Testament, there's a Old Testament scholar, Robert Alter, Jewish scholar, who's translated all of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and so he translates it a little afresh from a Jewish perspective, very steeped in the tradition, and also has extensive notes, which are sometimes really helpful. They often address things that most people are kind of wondering about. And so he's got now there's 3 volumes. There's the 5 books of Moses. There's I think the early prophets, and the wisdom literature or something. But so if you get anything from him, those are all really good. Finally, Old Testament. This is new-ish. Introduction to Old Testament, written by Rolf Jacobson, who's a professor at Luther, and Michael Chan. I'm not sure where he is. Do you know? Mm-mm. Both people that I've heard from and great things about and do good work. And so it's a nice introduction. And the nice thing is that 20, 30 years ago, all of these introductions were ridiculously technical, and would go into all these things that nobody really needs to know. And so now a lot of scholarship is getting back to, okay, what does it say? What's it trying to say? What's it trying to teach you? What is the context, and how does that help us understand it? Rather than going on and on about sources and archaeology and stuff that they're kind of realizing that was sort of a dead end. So those are a few recommendations. Now, okay, we look at. So, what are you guys interested in? Looking at Leviticus 19, Old Testament laws, David, women, and the importance of women and people who seem like wouldn't have any power actually being essential to the story. God's persistence, which kind of talked about a little already, or when it sometimes says God seems to change his mind. The Bible will say, well, and God changed his mind and didn't do this. Well, you already talked about the internal critique of the scripture. Poetry, just, what is the poetry? How does it work? Because, it's not like the poetry we're used to, and so if you kind of get a sense for how it works, it's a little maybe easier to hear or read. And then this idea of prophecy of fulfillment. So what does it say that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, and what does that really mean? Because it's not like a Nostradamus thing where some guy wrote a prediction and then Jesus made it happen. It's way bigger than that.
I think that's typically how people interpret that, though.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious. Okay. I mean, I don't know if others are, if they want to talk about other things, but how then should we understand, especially as Jesus says, I come to fulfill the law and the prophets?
Well, you remember that back in Matthew when he talks about the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he quotes from Isaiah. And then you go back to Isaiah in the context. The king is the prophet's trying to encourage the king that it's going to work out, God's going to do it. And the king doesn't want to listen, basically. So the prophet says, look, before this young woman, she's going to get pregnant, and while her child is still a toddler, all of these people attacking you are going to be gone. This is going to be all over. So he says that to the king. So it's this promise of that God will still be there. Jesus then Jesus fulfills it in that he's in the same line of that same tradition. This idea, this hope, this promise. So what in my mind what the New Testament often does is it's trying to say, look, God has been consistent. So when something is fulfilled, it's not that it didn't mean anything before. It's just it's like literally more full and filling out the same character of God. So also in Matthew, when it says they had to flee to Egypt, and then Matthew says this, fulfilled, where it says, out of Egypt I called my son. Well, in the passage that comes from, it's clearly talking about the people, slaves in Egypt, and they return, right? And so God's calling the people God's son. But you can also see is that a consistent theme of God's people having to be rescued, brought back. Jesus does that. A lot of Jesus' life sort of relives some of the things in the Old Testament. So to fulfill, I think it's best to think about that word fulfill. It fills it out, but it still has meaning previously just as good. And that's the problem with people just saying this is a future prediction. And why would anybody be keeping this for so long? Yeah.
So then the confusing part for me is that the Jewish people are still waiting. And I guess I assumed, because I haven't studied the Bible very much, I assume that the Old Testament is also the story of how the Jewish people are waiting for the prophet
Yeah.
or the Savior to come, right?
Yeah, and
So then that's confusing when, you know, that, because I was a person who just feels like Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecy.
yeah,
And that the Jewish people just didn't see it.
right. Well, one thing, you know, the Bible is really like a library of books, and you sort libraries differently. And so the way that the Jewish Bible is put together, it ends in 2 Chronicles with this promise of a return. So it ends with the restoration. And our Old Testament ends with the Micah and someone's going to come and prepare the way for the Lord.
Not Micah.
Malachi.
Malachi.
Yeah. So so even the way it's edited kind of changes what it means. But the other thing is that from the Jewish point of view is that, you know, they take the prophets seriously about what the Messiah and the age to come. And so their argument is, well, if that was Jesus, that never happened. So we're waiting for it to happen. So essentially, and it's the same thing that we think when we're thinking about Jesus coming back. You know, Jesus came, he was crucified, all this happened, but like we're still waiting for him to like really fix it. And so for us, that's like the second coming. In the Jewish mind, that's what the Messiah coming is. It's that. And then Paul goes into a whole argument about it, and you know, he's saying, well, who knows? God somehow works in some mysterious ways. Jewish understanding is more that they're a light to all people, God's light within the world, not necessarily that they need to bring more and more people in and, you know, populate heaven or whatever. And a good rabbi or a Jewish scholar, really great to listen to with the Old Testament, because they're also much more kind of playful or willing to, you know, wrestle with the text. So that's the thing with Jesus, is that if you're saying, okay, the Messiah is going to come and fix everything. Jesus was crucified, okay, but you know, he rose again, but Rome's still here. In 70 AD, like 40 years later, there was a rebellion and Jerusalem got totally flattened. 100 and so years later, it happened again. And the Jewish people then became very skeptical of anyone trying to claim to be a Messiah, because that usually led to some revolt and then them getting into a big war and getting wiped out. So they kind of, I think, approach things differently in a way. You know, and they, and in fact, they could really appreciate Jesus. There's a great New Testament scholar who's an Orthodox Jew, or at least conservative Jew, and she's great, and she's respectful of Christians and talks to churches a lot, and so it's really kind of coming down to, okay, who is Jesus really? So some people would say, no, he's within the line of the Old Testament, and great, and then Christians will say, no, it's more than that. So that you know, so it's not something. So the problem, if you're going to argue like, well, Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies, that's really circular, because, you know, it's not going to convince anyone. They would have to already think that there are all these clues encoded within the Bible, and that, you know, Jews just haven't seen that for some reason. But that's not. So, in some ways, we're sort of starting from the point of view of Christian faith already. I'm assuming most of you. I don't know if any of you like came from totally other tradition and just read the Bible and said, this is me. Right? I doubt it. So there's real value in the Jewish perspective, again, and also that honesty of being self-critical. I mean, you know, imagine, well, it is our Bible, but imagine, you know, your treasure stories of all these heroes, and it just shows them messing up over and over again, all the time, right? Noah survives the flood. It says, you know, he was the most righteous of his generation, although apparently his generation was terrible, so that's maybe not saying much. When he gets out of the flood, he plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and then his daughters get pregnant by him. You know, I mean, that's Noah. I mean, so this stuff, and the genealogy in Matthew of Jesus. There's 4 women mentioned. Ruth is one. And they're all women that, like, usually you would say these are not good family, family-friendly stories. Tamar, her father-in-law was Judah, who's the one that Jesus came from. She was married to one of his sons. He died. She married the other one. He died. And there was a third one that she was supposed to marry to kind of keep it within the family. But the dad, Judah, thought, well, she's cursed, so I'm not going to let her marry my son. So she's left with nothing. So what she does is she knows Judah's pattern, where he's going after he's done shearing his sheep or whatever. So she dresses up like a prostitute along the road. He sees her, says, can I lay with you? I don't have any money. She said, well, give me your signet ring and your staff, like your credit card and your driver's license. And I said, okay. And so they have sex. She gets pregnant. He goes back to collect his stuff and to pay, and there's no one there. He's a little embarrassed, so he doesn't do anything. Finds out a few months later, Tamar is pregnant. He's furious, and so he brings her in front of everyone. He's got to condemn her, and she comes out of the tent holding his staff and his signet ring. So the one who got me pregnant is the owner of these. And so there's nothing he can do, so he just marry her. They have kids. So that's her. So she became a prostitute. There's Rahab, who was the head of a brothel. First time the people in the wilderness for 40 years, they go to a city, the first place they go to is a brothel, and she hides them and then makes a deal. If I hide you, you guys need to keep me safe. And so they make a deal. Yeah, when they go to destroy the city, they'll keep her protected. Bathsheba's the other one, who, David saw and basically sent his guards to bring her and raped her. And then, trying to cover that up, he tried to get her husband to come back, so sort of maybe he would sleep with her and there wouldn't be an issue. He wouldn't. So David sent a letter with him, basically telling the general, put him at the worst part of the fight and then draw back so that he dies. And he does. So David, rapes her, then has her husband killed. But then Bathsheba continues in the story, and she's the one in the end who orchestrates Solomon becoming king. She ends up being a really powerful, influential figure, even though she started horribly. And so again, kind of sort of scandalous, but impressively brave, but not in your normal family-friendly way. And who's the other one?
You named 4.
I did. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Ruth was the other one.
Yeah, okay.
So then the business of people who take it so literally, the religious people who the Bible says this, therefore this is how we must respond. So that a thing that struck me that you said is the Jewish scholars sort of playfully working with what's in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So that is the purpose that we learn from these stories, but things that people use as rules.
Right. Yeah, one important thing I remember learning in college, we were doing some Old Testament Bible study, and the woman leading it said, just because somebody does it in the Bible doesn't mean that's what you're supposed to do. These aren't meant to be models. And, when we clean it up and make kid stories, it seems like it, but if you read the actual story, you don't want any of your kids to be like this. Jacob, he's an idiot, and he's, terrible, and he's a trickster and all this stuff, but he's, he's the head of the 12 people in the 12 tribes. He has these 12 sons and a daughter, and of course, 9 of the sons try to kill Joseph. And, they kept these stories, and so most of them are descended from one of the tribes that tried to kill Joseph. So there's that honesty, and also there one thing I appreciate in some of the Jewish readings of things. Sometimes they'll say, okay, but that's not right. So something else must be going on. Like they take some common sense and say, okay. My example, this is just my own thing. Elisha, follow Elijah. He takes over his role. He does all these fancy miracles. He's really, getting up on himself. And then he's going to town, and some young guys start calling him Baldy. And it says, so then he called on a she-bear to come and maul them. They maul. Okay, so
Can we do that?
yeah. So to me, that's just showing us, okay, he's gotten way out of hand. Like, he's gotten too big for his britches. I mean, because clearly that's not right. And so, you have some common sense to say, okay, so this must not be a story about don't make fun of old people, or if they do make fun of you, it's okay to have them torture, whatever. Yeah.
Did Joseph have any sinful things that we're told about in the Bible?
Yeah, well, he started out kind of a brat. That's why his brothers didn't like him. He had these dreams that everyone bowed down to him. And then it said he used to go and check on his brothers and come report back to his dad whether they were working. And so the time when they finally put him in the pit, he was doing that at that time. And, he was favored by his dad. He had the special robe and all this stuff. So he was kind of a spoiled brat. He's not very likable if you can put yourself in their shoes. And then, of course, later when, the brothers come and he's going to get out the grain, he's still unsure what to do. He kind of toys with them. I mean, the first time they come, he puts all their money back and sends them back and says, you have to bring your youngest, Benjamin. So they bring him back, and then he plants his special cup in Benjamin's sack, gets them to all swear, no, if any of us have it, you can put us in jail, and sure enough, he has it. And, I mean, he really strings them along until finally, when Judah, whose idea was to sell him as a slave, offers to become a slave to free his younger brother. And that's what Joseph it switches. And then there's sort of that reunion. And then the great line at the end where, the brothers are worried that he's going to get revenge when the dad dies. And Joseph said, what you intended for evil, God made into good. And that's sort of like that whole story. I mean, all these people doing terrible stuff. If you remember Jerry Springer or whatever, the patriarchs, their family would be on there, definitely, many times. Many, many times.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much of the early Old Testament has to be oral history.
Right.
Okay, so if it's oral history, and, assuming somebody or some buddies edited this to bring it together, to make some of this make sense, they must have just had to kind of create some bridges, I would think, to try to get it to flow and follow and so forth. And that's brings to the thought that, somebody may have tried to put a little slant on it that they wanted. Wasn't necessarily divine, it's, this is kind of the way I'd like to have this figured.
Right, or everybody has a little different perspective, and that's one of the reasons I think the Bible has so many different perspectives, because it's sort of almost admitting that in a way. But what's interesting about all of these things with the sources, and they came up with there's these 4 sources, and the story was as if somebody literally cut and paste and just mishmashed it together, and look how obvious it is. But clearly somebody thought it made sense how we have it now. And so, we want it to be one way, but people were okay with, these things happening twice, and why is that, and what's going on? And Robert Alter does some good work on narrative in the Bible, and these, how it uses, type stories, like going to the well is where you find a wife, or, there's some little formulas.
Or going up the mountain.
Yeah. And we have formulas, you're at the bar and so you're going to meet somebody or whatever. And it's not to say that that's wrong, but it's cultures do that because you have to you're not going to tell the whole thing. Right? So in the Genesis 1, beginning, God makes light, and then God separates the waters, and then God makes the land. And then God makes the sun. Well, apparently there were days, but there was no sun. There was light, but there was no sun or stars. So clearly it's not trying to give us a straightforward chronological event. It's trying to explain a whole lot of stuff in a poetic way. And that's one of the challenges, I think, is that we don't want to think poetically. We want to just think scientifically, straightforward, or whatever, modern thinking. But the Bible is much more comfortable with poetry. So the way that Hebrew poetry works, mostly, is it repeats things. So like when I'm teaching the confirmation kids, your traditional, old-fashioned, whatever English poem, Dr. Seuss, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, right? You know to expect what's going to rhyme. And they don't. And the Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme sounds, but ideas. So say this one way, and then it kind of says it different. And if you're going to be a real stickler, like, well, that's not the same thing, but it's trying to say more than it can say in just once. So the poetry kind of evokes a larger image or picture of God and stuff. And so that's another challenge, because we're expecting it, this to be some manual instruction. And like you said, it was mostly heard by people. And it wasn't ever put in one bound volume, hardly ever, until the printing press. So these are always stories that were circulating among people, generations telling more generations over and over. We had a few scholars that would read it, but most people just heard it. And so now we come to it expecting something really different, like it's a textbook or something, or a history book. I like to, like with the Gospels, sometimes I'll have people start out, write down what you did yesterday. And people will write a few things down, and no one will write everything down. You've got to always, make a choice. And so all these stories, lots of choices are made. What are we going to focus on? What are we going to highlight? Sometimes you tell a story, it's not technically right, but if you tell it a certain way, you can cover a whole lot of stuff in a more simpler way that's easier to understand. You're not going to say, my alarm went off, I hit snooze, I sat there for a few minutes. You're not going to tell everything in your day. Right? You're going to just highlight a few things. So people when they get all stuck on, well, Jesus says this there, but he says it differently there. And I'm like, they're taking a whole lot of Jesus, a lot of things he said, and it's really condensed. I mean, 1 up to 3 years of all this teaching, healing, and stuff in 15 pages. So, it is very condensed and on purpose. And I think when people are used to stories being told, they kind of understand that when someone's telling a story, this isn't an exact videotape of the event, because that wouldn't be a story, and we can't do that.
Well, I think about the way you told even the story of Ruth today.
Right.
Because actually I happened to be preaching on that on Sunday. And the theme is broken by grief. And so the focus is on the friendship and Naomi's grief and this,
Right.
and you really didn't mention grief at all.
No.
No, but you could have. I mean, that's a piece of the story.
Oh, yeah.
And so just in that happening here today, you told this story in a way that we're going to hear it differently on Sunday.
Right, and you can see why, because I'm sort of making an argument for the value of the New Testament. So what I'm sort of highlighting in Ruth is the ways that the echoes of certain laws and with David and all these things. So I'm focusing on that. But there's other people that talk about Naomi becomes Mara and her bitterness and all this stuff.
Changes her name.
Yeah. And you could focus on that, but we're not.
Well, that works with our Lenten theme. I mean, I have an agenda to focus on
right.
that, and that's not wrong.
Right.
It's just a different emphasis.
Yeah, I think the danger is when somebody pretends they don't have a purpose or agenda, as if this is just pure straight, the full-on truth, everything.
I missed what you said about the Moabites, and she was from a bad place.
Yeah, they were Lot. You remember Abraham? Lot, his daughters got pregnant by him or something, and that was supposedly where the Edomites came from. But they were like on the border, and always didn't get along, and so they were like the bad guys. And so it's like, don't ever let an Edomite near the temple of God for 10 generations. So it says that in the law, and yet the Bible then shows that happening.
And it being really important that it happened. Yeah.
Right, their most important king and everything. Yeah, his great-grandma was Moabite. So.
Do you think there are some things that are in the Old Testament that maybe aren't that important?
Well, yeah, I mean, you gotta choose some stuff.
Right. I mean, I see like Ruth and how Ruth leads us to get to the lineage that Jesus becomes part of, right? That was kind of your point about that, right?
Yeah, and that Jesus is in this whole line of like outsiders or people that were maybe not were probably looked down upon, gossiped about, had all kinds of sketchy parts of their past. And Jesus, as Mary's pregnant, well, it's not my baby. It's a convenient story. Well, God made me pregnant. I mean, you can imagine that. Yeah, there's a lot of controversy about that in the beginning. I think there were some critics of Christianity that tried to claim it was a centurion was really Jesus' dad. I don't know, but yeah. But again, when you say they're important or not important, it depends on what you're getting out of it. So this idea of genre means like a recipe is meant for making something. A novel is meant kind of to tell a story and be entertaining, but you wouldn't expect them to do that. So some of the Bible we're expecting one thing out of it, and it's not doing that. The genealogies, which usually really get people stuck. One thing that clicked for me, like 15 years ago or something, they set up a Memorial Day in Spring Grove, and had names of all people who had served in the military. And so you've got all these names. Why do we do that? Because somebody can say, oh, I know that person I'm related to. We don't say, what a waste of space, right? We list all these people. And so the Bible does that. They list all these names. We're like, well, that's boring, but it was so somebody could say, that's my great-great-grandparents, or I'm named after that person or something. So if you're gonna read it to try to figure out history, but if you can see they're trying to name the people from the past. You don't have to get a lot out of it. You just can kind of get the sense of their connection to their ancestors. So I think that's part of it. I mean, you could say, yeah, there are parts that are not important, but and then Jonah. So the book of Jonah, right? Everybody makes a big deal about the whale and so on. I think any really reasonable person reading it, you see it's really kind of a parable. I don't think it's really even trying to claim to be something that happened. So Jonah basically does not, he hates Nineveh, but he's supposed to tell them to repent, and he doesn't want to, so he tries to run away. Fish protect, he gets eaten by fish, and he goes, and finally he goes there, and all he says is, in 30 days Nineveh will be destroyed. That's all.
He's so half-hearted about it.
Yeah, just mumbling, and it says, people say it's a 3-day journey across the city and argue, well, Nineveh's not that big. I read that as he was going so slow, it took him 3 days to get around the city because he was not in a hurry. And surprisingly, they listened to him and repented. No other prophets do anyone listen to. So then the Ninevites, these notorious horrible people do, and Jonah is really upset. It's not fair. How can you be gracious, right? So, and Jonah says, I'd rather die than see you forgive these people. And so it's all about, okay, what do we do if God's forgiving to someone we don't want God to forgive? Jonah's this example of, well, sometimes God's going to forgive even if we may think he should. So it's not to try to figure out what kind of fish swallowed him, what was the date, or what kind of ship did he go on, all that stuff. It's really has a whole arc of God's mercy. And clearly Nineveh, that didn't happen. Nineveh didn't turn around. Nineveh stayed bad the whole time and got taken over by Babylon. There was no record of, suddenly Nineveh was great for, I don't know, a month or something. No, so they used we might use Nazis or something, the proverbial bad people. What if God forgives them? So yeah, it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. If you're just trying to learn history or certain things, you're learning principles, but it's not. You don't have to claim it was historical in the sense that we would normally think. Like parables, nobody really tries to claim that there really was this Samaritan who helped some guy. Jesus is telling a story to illustrate a point, and so most people don't expect that to be literal.
Right.
But we tend to want a whole lot more out of the Bible than or different than what it's actually giving us. And I like to just go back to poetry. If real good poetry evokes a whole lot, but you can't take it literally in a way. I mean, you've got to. It functions differently. I remember in high school I was supposed to do a paper on like a Walt Whitman poem or something. I did not understand because I was taking it so literally until finally my teacher, no, this is, meant to be an image for this and that. Oh, okay, now. I was just taking it as a description. I was a science major to start with, and I just said, well, just say it as quick and short as you can and just be straight to the point and, nothing extraneous. And the Bible does not do that.
The Bible does not do that.
I don't.
How do you respond to folks who are really troubled by, sort of back to Marcion for a minute, by the meanness, the wrathful, the angry, the judgment, the image of God that often gets attributed to the Old Testament?
Right. A lot of those instances are people are trying to give reasons that God had for doing something, but not necessarily God giving the reason. So, it's clearly these people's witness, but God's not coming in. Okay, this is why it all happened, and writing it all down. Especially because some things will contradict each other, and so you got to remember the context, the time. The other thing that I think is one of the most important principles to know is that the Israelite Hebrew people were a tiny, tiny, insignificant, pretty powerless people. They were huge empires all around. They were like nobodies. There's these letters from kings back and forth, Egypt, and all these powerful leaders. No one sent any to any leaders in Judah or Israel. They're mentioned maybe once, but nobody even thought about them. And so when you read these things about, God's wrath on the kings and, all these bold statements, it means one thing when it's coming from people who have nothing versus, a superpower making these claims. So, just to remember also the context, these people, they had hardly anything. When you first read it, you're imagining the grandeur of all this, and then you look at the map, and then it's this tiny little spot, and you look at all these other empires and armies and stuff, and they're just like, a little rest stop along the highway somewhere. And I think that helps see it a little differently. So if we're reading it as if it was written by Americans and all this stuff, that says something different than when it's written by people who have been oppressed and enslaved and all that stuff. So and the other thing about the Bible is it's also really good at being honest about how people feel. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily right, but it's, the Psalms will get angry, and because people get angry. It's not saying, that's necessarily good or bad, but we do. And like in that Psalm 139, we can bring it all to God. Even when we're really upset, feeling self-righteous, whatever, or feeling like God's left us. My God, why have you forsaken me? We want the prayers to all be these nice little model perfect prayers said by people who are perfect little people, but no, they're words of real, living, struggling humans. And so they'll get angry. And when people get angry, you're not going to judge their anger. They're just angry. So the psalm about why the waters of Babylon, and then may your babies get dashed their head against the wall or whatever. Well, it's because that's what happened to them, and so it's kind of a revenge fantasy, but they're willing to just say it, and the Bible's willing to just keep it there, not because this is a good thing, but just people are like this. People do get mad. People do want revenge. The only reason we have most of the New Testament is because churches were not getting along. We're not doing good. And so Paul had to keep writing over and over about all the problems they're having. And they were probably a little bigger than this group here. And they had a lot of problems. This is way back. So, when we were worried, in the church, we're having all these issues, that's been going on forever. So it's, if we want to whitewash it all, then I think we're expecting something it's not trying to give us.
How do you decide what's true and what isn't
What do you mean?
in the Bible?
Well,
Just a small question for the last minute here.
So, I always say that the more you read the Bible, the more you can get out of it. And so I think my understanding is always growing and changing. Does that make sense? So there's never a point where I'm like, okay, I know this is true and I'm going to write these down and that's it. It's more organic, evolving. It's a story. Sometimes it's inspiration. Sometimes it's discouraging. Sometimes it's boring, but it's all there. So that true is, I think, yeah, you're trying to ask a question that.
Like you're actually not going at it trying to figure out what's true.
Well, not in the sense of like historically accurate, right? Because again, there's the whole idea like truth doesn't necessarily mean like
Factual.
historical facts, right? Yeah, something could be true and not. My family, when my family would get together, and my dad was there, they'd always be telling some story, and then they'd mention some car, and my dad always knew the car they had, so they'd get in this whole argument about which car they were driving at the time. It's still, the story still works no matter what. There's people that look at the Old Testament and they're like, well, there's camels there in Abraham. There weren't camels in that day. Well, yeah, we do that all the time. I mean, the people that, when they were writing this down, camels were the animal they knew that traveled, so they used camels. But if you're gonna like get into an argument, well, they couldn't have been camel, and you're arguing over is a Studebaker or a whatever. So it's, yeah, and that the thing is, people did that for so long. It was just, it was so stuck in so much scholarship. And then you get reactions against it, so people were trying to really make sure it is all true. There's a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's been out for a long time.
By Josh
McDowell.
Yeah.
I got the latest version. It's interesting. Over time, it gets much more nuanced if you really read it. In fact, I did a little deep dive into fundamentalism and inerrancy in Scripture. And there's a statement, there's the Chicago blah, blah, blah statement on inerrancy. And so this is the standard. And I was reading through it, but there's one paragraph that says, well, we do admit that sometimes the Bible exaggerates, uses hyperbole. Numbers aren't always, meant to be taken literally. Sometimes certain, narrative things are done, or certain things that are peculiar to this. I mean, all this, I'm like, really? You say that? Because, it's in there, but nobody is reading that part. But if you read that, I think most of us are on the page with it. It's just getting into all the other stuff. So they'll start hedging their bets the more you look at it. In my opinion.
The word true has a couple, at least two different meanings.
Mhm.
It can be truth even though it didn't happen historically.
Right. So when you have the family arguing over details about, the truth of the story is not in those details, it's what they're trying to say. Right? And I think our biggest liability is TV and media and all that. So we can now see things as they had happened. Nobody ever had that before. The only way you ever knew about anything in the past is somebody had to tell you about it, or you had to retell it. And so and nobody was going around fact checking all that. So, we're expecting the Bible to have this video, the closed captioning, but that's because of our culture. So when you're saying is it true or what's truth, I mean, are you saying factually, historically verifiable, or logically consistent, and all these things? That's not trying to do that. And,
So when you think about what the Bible is trying to do, how do you say that?
yeah, well, okay, so it's it's a witness of people of faith who are open and honest about all of their flaws, and who are testifying to the fact that God is stuck with them, and God has remained faithful even when they aren't faithful, and God continually trying to get the people to go back to treating each other well, being good. There's the the Ten Commandments. I'm the Lord who took you out of Egypt, and there's 40 times where God says in there, remember to treat the foreigners in your land well, because you were once foreigners yourself. And the fact that God has to say it over and over again means they probably weren't doing it very well. So, another great thing about the Old Testament is there's a lot of really ethical foundations to what we believe is right that are in there. And so you don't want to just throw all that out. especially issues like immigration right now and treating neighbors are huge in the Old Testament, and not really mentioned much in the New.
But they are there in the New Testament.
There, Jesus was a refugee in Egypt and stuff. Yeah, but the Old Testament is just straight out says it. You shall not have a different law for the foreigner or citizen among you. That just says it. So
Well, and that's why we all do that all the time.
I know, right? Yeah, it's interesting. I heard there was some debate between two lawmakers there about, I don't know if it was true or if this was a fictional, but arguing about the Bible, and it was very insightful in like what people will lift up here and what people will lift up there, and they'll be completely blind to something because they're focusing in one spot. I know a big thing right now in a conservative reaction to what's going on is to cite Romans 13, where it says, you should be subject to the governing authorities because they're there to all this stuff. Well,
They've
Paul's
been,
writing to Rome.
they've been instituted by God.
Nero, I think, was the emperor probably at the time, or close to it, who nobody would try to claim was a good guy at all. Paul's just trying to, just lay low so you don't get killed kind of stuff. It's a totally different thing, and you're this tiny minority, in danger for your lives always, versus, you're a voting citizen in a democratic country or something. And Paul actually probably got beheaded by that emperor, so maybe it wasn't good advice. I don't know. So sometimes I wonder if Paul would be appalled at how we take some of his stuff. It's like, I was just writing a letter to that. It was just about some issue, and you guys have taken it way out of hand. Oh, one thing I think I've touched on a little bit, but it's really amazing to see throughout the narrative how central are like, women and sort of unnamed or non-powerful people. Every corner. In Exodus it begins, Pharaoh's never named, but we hear about Moses' mother, Moses' sister, the princess, and the midwives are named. They're all named. Pharaoh's never named. And Pharaoh comes off kind of like an idiot. And yeah, so it's amazing when you start looking for it, how so many of these stories are propelled along by someone's wife or some other person coming in or doing whatever. It's really amazing. I mean, really, all of Genesis, that story would have never happened without nearly all the women really taking control and guiding it. So.
Sounds like the church.
But then you have churches that don't let women vote, and
Yeah, and
Pastor Libby wouldn't be able to participate.
And the thing that I think is so stupid about that, so they'll take it out of 1 Corinthians. He says women should not speak. But 2 chapters earlier, he told women what to wear while they're speaking. Church. So once you don't assume that Paul is against women, you're like, oh, maybe he's not. And like he's got all these women leaders doing fellow workers in the gospel and apostles and so on. And so yeah, people really took their sort of misogyny too seriously, and then just that's all they could see. I think that's an injustice to Paul, really. I think some of it too, like, you guys, I don't know if you guys still have lady circles and stuff, right? The ladies, Welka, whatever, they don't have a technical vote as a group, right? But they're their own thing. Now, you could imagine if a couple of circles got a little out of hand, we're taking over the annual meeting, you might write, okay, the ladies are not, they do not have a legal standing within the congregation meeting or something, meaning that group as that group, but someone might read that as, oh, women don't vote or something, so there so many specific things that we don't really know.
Things we try to turn into black and white
Yeah, that too.
that aren't necessarily
Or whatever
Or
color we
we're
want
not
them to be,
intending.
and then, yeah.
right.
Well, that's why I said earlier, it's take something and put it on a slant so that you can accomplish what you're trying to do or influence people, and the interpretation of what you just said there, so you can say, well, women can't vote. women can't supervise a man that's older than 18.
Yeah.
Or something like that. I mean, give me a break.
So what do you think is essential for studying the Bible?
So, I think it's good to get an overall grasp of the general context and the way the story's going. So sometimes it's better to kind of get your head wrapped around the big structure and then to start diving in, because sometimes you just dive in one spot and it's a bit overwhelming. So I would recommend certain, like, I think Genesis is a great book. You can pretty much take it as it is and get a lot out of it. Jonah, Ruth, Ecclesiastes, not Ecclesiastes, Esther. I'm going to tell that story. But there's lots of good stories, and then I think you start with the stories and then kind of work out from there.
And you don't do it by yourself. That's one of the things I think is really...
And I found it really good to get an audio Bible and listen. So much easier. I get way too distracted when I just try to read it.
Thank you, Pastor Len.
Yep, you're welcome.
I'm glad that you came today.
I do have something for you. This is, I've updated it since I handed it out to the pastors, but
Okay.
this is my little pocket Old Testament. So I've got a few things about every book in the Bible. Sometimes just a sentence. Some of them are a little flippant. Some of them are more serious. But just to kind of a little teaser to get you wondering about it. So Leviticus, say a few things and don't be a jerk. Because a lot of the laws are, don't be a jerk. Don't be a jerk. Because it says, don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. Don't insult a deaf person. Don't be a jerk. It's not. A lot of it is that.
Well, and Rolf Jacobson, the author of the textbook,
Yeah.
his title of Leviticus, if he could have one, is he plays off of the Joel Osteen book, Your Best Life Now. And he says, if Leviticus had a title, it would be called Your Neighbor's Best Life Now. That the whole point of the Levitical code is to how shall you treat your neighbor? But it's in a culture and system that is so different than ours, so it just doesn't resonate in a lot of ways. But your neighbor's best life now, and that changed Leviticus for me when I was able to sort of hear those laws in terms of how they were meant for a group of people in a particular time and place, rather than the way they often get hurled and used against certain groups of people, particularly gay people.
Yeah,
So,
and even like the sexual
22.
parts, if
Yeah.
I think the Bible's assuming everybody is married, there are a lot of single people around. So if you're talking about having sex with a man or whatever, that's adultery in the first place, or there's incest and stuff. But it's like we think in totally different categories. So.
yeah.